Welcome back, everyone, to week 9. We're still in that development phase of our ADDIE model. This week, taking a look at interactive materials. Specifically, we want to answer the question, how can learners engage with our content? This is part of our ongoing learning objective for this unit, right? We're trying to generate different types of instructional materials, and today we're going to focus on interactive materials. Now, before we get into today's content, where we start talking about how students are interacting with things, I thought first we should talk about Webb's depth of knowledge, since that's going to come up today. A lot of you might know about the depths of knowledge. These are commonly called DOKs in education. You might hear DOK 1, 2, 3, that sort of thing. And Webb's depths of knowledge, which came out in 97, is similar to describing a lake. Right, there are different depths of the lake. And depending on where you're going to be at in the lake, you might be in the shallow end or in the deep end. And when we're talking depths of knowledge, we're essentially using that lake analogy for learning, right? You can have shallow learning that's kind of surface level, or you can have really deep, impactful learning, okay? And Webb's depths of knowledge, he breaks learning down to 4 levels. Level 1 is things like recall and reproduction. Okay, very basic level learning. Level 2, you're able to execute on skills and understand basic concepts. While level 3 is considered strategic thinking, and level 4 is that extended thinking. Okay, so when we talk about DOK levels today, I'm talking about this spectrum. Okay, where the deeper we get, the deeper the learning that's taking place. All right, starting off with ways our students can engage in learning is the generic passive learning, right? The very first one, the one with the least student interaction, right? And passive learning, what happens is the learner is essentially a passive observer, okay? The instructor is the one that's presenting the content and teaching the lesson. The learner kind of sits there passively trying to soak up information, and hopefully they can prove that they've learned something on a test at the end. Okay? When I think of passive learning, I often think of behaviorism, because we're teaching students something and we're observing their behavior on a test afterwards. Okay? Now, passive learning is very useful. It's essentially direct instruction, and it happens a lot. And a good way to see if that direct instruction is taking hold is by doing knowledge checks, right? We're going to take a look at that here in a sec. Now, when it comes to passive learning knowledge checks, usually we're talking about traditional assessment, right? You present some kind of instructional content to students, and there is a follow-up knowledge check at the end to see if they've learned it or not learned it, right? In the behaviorism world, we're giving them a stimulus, and we're seeing, does their behavior change? Okay, when we teach them this content, does that change how they perform on the test? Okay, and typically we test at the end, or another popular option is a post-test model, right? Where we do a pre-test, we teach them something, and then a post-test. Okay, so when we're talking passive learning, there's a couple different ways you can do knowledge checks, either at the end or before and after. But essentially, we're just assessing where students are at based on this direct instruction that they're receiving. Next, as far as the type of knowledge checks we'll be doing, with passive learning, what works great a lot of time is just simple practice or quiz problems, right? Give them a problem after they've observed something and see if they can solve it, right? This is things like free response problems, multiple choice problems. You might have sorting or organizing. Maybe a drag and drop interface in this world of technology is really good there. And with passive learning, it's really easy to hit that DOK 1 and DOK 2 level. Okay? These types of knowledge checks are really good for checking basic recall or basic skills and concepts. Okay? So when we're talking level 1 and level 2 knowledge, consider passive learning. And those quick interactions of maybe free response or multiple choice questions, things like that. And the next engagement style we have to talk about is active learning, right? In active learning, students are actively working through a problem or actively thinking about something, in order to better understand it, right? They're turning it around in their mind. And as such, I think active learning really lends to that cognitivism thinking style, where we're concerned what our learner is thinking about. We want them to be thinking about the content, discussing the content, and processing that information, right? So as an instructor, you're trying to promote thinking in active learning, and the learner's role is to participate in some activity and think about it, okay? So that's the big difference there. Instead of a passive observer, now they're participating in an activity to trigger that cognitive loop, to trigger them thinking about whatever content we're talking about. So some popular engagement strategies with active learning is things like discussions or reflections, right? So some options there. So now if we take a look at what this active learning might look like, we're going to have some kind of instructional activity that the students can participate in. The students are going to reflect and think about the activity. They're going to share their thoughts, either written down, or share them with others. And then that loop kind of continues, right? We reflect and think over the thoughts others share, and then maybe we share again. Okay? So you can see this is like our discussion posts week to week follow this format. Right? There's an activity, a post for you guys to reflect and think about. You share your thoughts. Other students read those thoughts, they reflect and think, and they reply to the post, right? So this is active learning. So when checking for knowledge in an active learning style, okay, discussion and reflection prompts are a great idea there. You can have either short answer or essay-like questions. You can do some Socratic questioning, which is essentially follow-up questions. Why do you think that? That's interesting. How did you come to that point? Why did you choose this as your point, right? So Socratic questioning, kind of giving those follow-up questions to really get students thinking and reconsidering their points. Another strategy, think, pair, share. You think about something, and then you share it in your pair. As well as group discussions, or like we talked about last slide, those online discussion boards. Okay, so these are all great active learning examples where students are actively thinking through something while they're responding, usually with others, and getting that feedback. As far as DOK levels, I would say active learning fits a little better at level 2 or level 3, okay, where we're trying to teach students skills. Maybe they're teaching them a thought process about how to come to a conclusion given a situation, right? And then also that strategic thinking layer for sure when we're talking active learning. So some good options there. Okay, and our last engagement strategy I want to talk about today is called experiential learning. It was made popular by David Kolb in his 1984 book on the topic. And it's essentially where students are learning through their experiences. Okay, so not only are we working through something actively and thinking about it, but we're creating an experience that we can draw upon to connect our learning to. Right? So this to me is more the constructivist mindset. We're intentionally building in an experience that we can connect our learning to. Right? We're concerned with how students are constructing that knowledge. As an instructor, your job here would be to facilitate that experience, to facilitate the thinking about it and the reaction to it. The learner's job is to experience something and then react. And this is really a great strategy when we're talking about things like simulations or role play, specifically. All right, so what does experiential learning look like? Well, first off, students are faced with some kind of instructional experience. Maybe students are role-playing as engineers and they're given a problem to solve. Students then reflect and think on the experience they've had, and they take action within that role play or within that simulation. And that generates more experience. Maybe they're given feedback on that decision and they have to adjust, or maybe they're just given the next part of the problem to figure out, right? But in experiential learning, there's this closed loop that students can go through multiple times throughout the experience to kind of get practice of reflecting and thinking about a problem and taking action, right? With each of these loops, they're getting 1 rep at that problem solving process, and the goal is to give them lots of reps through this experience. Now, when we're talking about experiential learning scenarios, really, in my mind, we're talking about simulations, right? How do we simulate either a real world problem or even an imaginary problem that gets students to practice the content we want them to practice, right? This might be a real world activity, something they're actually doing. Hey, we're going to build a shed in shop today, and we're going to learn through that shared experience. This might be role play, right? You guys are going to be NASA engineers, and we're going to create this rocket ship in today's lesson. How do we go about doing that? Well, students are going to learn through that process. Could also be a computer simulation, right? Or a computer game that students are learning through, right? That's taking them through this experiential loop. Even virtual reality scenarios, right? When we're talking about really putting the student in that situation, like virtual reality is a great way to do that as that technology starts to come along. Okay, so lots of options there. And with experiential learning, we can really hit any of the higher level depths of knowledge. You can cover specific skills and concepts that we're practicing in this role play, or you can learn about strategic or extended thinking and take it to that level of learning as well. As far as some popular technologies go for training development, when we're talking about creating student engagement, right, there are kind of 2 big software programs that allow for that engagement piece, right? I'm sure a lot of you guys have done trainings where the training will give you a situation and then it stops and asks you a quiz question. Things like that are often created in either Adobe Captivate or Articulate 360. Okay, so these are the 2 kind of major training software development programs. I've heard of them described as kind of a juiced up PowerPoint where you have your different slides and then you might have quiz slides or test slides as well. So I just wanted to talk about these. We're not going to go too in depth on them in the course because they are both quite expensive, and I don't want you guys to feel like you have to buy these. But if training something you're really interested in, if you really like the instructional design field, it might be worth it to get a membership of one of those and try that out. Okay, but that's optional for our project that's coming up. You do not have to use one of these, but I just wanted to talk about them because they are quite popular and useful for building these trainings with that interactive component built in. Okay, to finish things off, I just want to talk a little bit about Project 3. Okay, you're going to start working on that this week and finish it over the next 2 weeks. Okay, but for Project 3, I just want you guys to create some learning materials, right? It's going to be for a short lesson, 15 to 20 minutes. I'll show you the rubric here in a second, but this is kind of a summarized version. But essentially what I want to see is a multimedia project. Okay, so we're going to use both words and pictures. And when I'm grading these, I'm going to look towards Mayer's tips, Mayer's multimedia principles. So if I dock you on something, it's going to be because you didn't follow one of Mayer's advice points on managing that extraneous cognitive load, the intrinsic cognitive load, and the generative processing. Okay, so we'll talk more about those in a minute. I'd also like to see some of the knowledge checks we discussed today included. So I'd like you to include 1 practice and 1 quiz problem as far as that passive learning interaction. I'd like you to include 1 discussion or reflection prompt, right, focusing on that active learning. And then finally, at the end of the project, you're going to include a simulation follow-up proposal. Essentially, just saying, what simulation would follow this lesson well? You don't have to create the simulation. I just want the basic idea. Okay? So that's going to be Project 3. Next, we can take a look at kind of the long form rubric. But that's the summarized version. It is due 11/3. I know Amazon Web Services went down yesterday, so if you guys need 1 extra day on that and want to turn it on the 4th, that is absolutely fine. But let's take a look at our rubric for Project 3. So here is our project 3 assignment. Okay, similar to the last 2 projects, you've been hired, you're a manager for a new training or consulting program, right? You can stay with that idea you've been working on all semester, or you can pivot to a new idea if you prefer. Okay, but I'd like you to produce and submit a multimedia learning document. Okay, something to support the learning of the training you're talking about. This can be PowerPoint presentation, section of a workbook, right? An instructional video, written guide, anything that's a multimedia document, really. Okay, I want to leave this open so you guys can be creative if you'd like. If you just want to make a PowerPoint or a Word document of a workbook, that's totally fine. Or you can get creative with it if you'd like as well. Things that I would like to see. Okay, we want to support the introduction of new learning content for a short lesson, 10 to 15 minutes. Okay, that's kind of all the guidelines I'm going to give you. Be as creative as you'd like with that. As far as grading goes in the format, I'm checking that our learning document introduces some new content, that there's enough here to support 10 to 15 minute lesson, and that we have a multimedia document, right? We're using both words and pictures. When I'm looking at your guys' document, I'm going to be looking to grade based on Mayer's principles. Okay, so starting with Mayer's principles for reducing extraneous processing, right? I will check these 5 bullet points and make sure those are present in your document. Okay, not all of these may be present, right? If you're not doing a video, maybe you don't worry about temporal contiguity, right? That really is only applicable if you're doing something where simultaneous presentation's possible. So if you're doing just a PowerPoint or a Word document, don't worry about that one. That's okay. Okay, but we're going to look at all Mayer's principles. So the extraneous processing is one category. The essential processing is another, as well as the generative processing. Okay, so I'm not going to reread all of those principles, but make sure you're looking them over. Make sure that in your work you've covered your basis. This is kind of a great checklist, I think, when you're making a multimedia document to go through it and make sure your things are set up accordingly. And then when we get to our knowledge checks, I'd like you to have, right, each of the types of checks we talked about built in. So as far as passive learning, I would like to see at least 1 practice problem and 1 quiz or test problem. As far as active learning, I'd like to see 1 discussion or reflection prompt built into the lesson. And as far as experiential learning, okay, this I would like to include it at the end. And I just would like you to talk about 1 simulation or role play activity. Okay, this might be, hey, now that we're done with this lesson, we're going to play this game on X, right? Or we're going to do a role play scenario including this. You don't have to have all the details of that lesson included. I just want a basic premise. I want you all thinking about what simulation would be a good follow-up to the lesson. Okay, and to talk about that. All right, but that's it. That's everything we've got for project 3. This one is due, I don't have it on here, but it is on the site 11/3. Okay. Remember, you have office hours or email if you have any questions on any of this, but you guys have a wonderful week.